What's kicking, little chickens? It's your boy, Mr. Northrup, and there is no need to adjust your television sets. I am this amazing. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about the decade that followed World War I, the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, as they were so cleverly nicknamed, brought us television, the Band-Aid, water skis, convertibles, the cheeseburger, lie detectors, sunglasses, and Steamboat Willie. What a time to be alive! And with that, we've reached the end of the 1920s. Catch y'all on the flippity flip. Yes, I'm sorry, boss. Of course, it'll never happen again. So it turns out we have so much more to talk about when it comes to the decade of prosperity. In fact, that's where I want to begin this lesson. You see, when I was in school, I remember learning that the 1920s were just this time of short, frilly dresses, secret underground booze parties, and weird flaily arm dancing. But it turns out it was so much more than that. Now, before the global economy went to crap and the world was flushed down the toilet in the 30s, many Americans were living like it was 1999, only with way fewer boy bands. Eesh. The 20s ushered in this social revolution that introduced us to all sorts of possibilities as we demobilized from a wartime to a peacetime economy. But it was far from a simple transition. As the world leaders debated the terms of a peace agreement, the United States focused on a series of otherwise unrelated factors that compounded the chaos of an attempt to return to normalcy. Among them were terrible racial tensions and a spike in nativist behavior, the tail end of a flu pandemic, anti-communist hysteria, and great economic uncertainty. Not so fun fact, the 1920s weren't just followed by a massive economic depression. They were actually kicked off by one as well. The post-World War I depression was inevitable as millions of soldiers returned to a life that had sort of moved on without them. In the US, economic uncertainty coupled with the return of nearly 5 million veterans led to a huge spike in unemployment, and desperate times called for desperate measures. Now, as a consumer, I love how the situation was handled. Mass production of goods like automobiles, vacuum cleaners, and electric razors lowered prices and made these products available to the average middle-class family. But what about those families who didn't have enough disposable income for such luxury purchases? Well, the introduction of credit meant that for the first time, those families had the option to pay using installment plans. As a realist, with the sense of hindsight, allowing Americans to live well beyond their means in hopes that the market would magically thrive without any repercussions might not have been the best fix for the issue at hand. Nevertheless, they persisted. Another way the US government thought to boost the economy was to increase tariffs on many of the imported goods in hopes of protecting factories and farms. While campaigning for the 1920 presidential election, Republican Warren Harding made many promises to protect American farmers. He made good on that promise when he signed the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act in 1922, a law that would raise tariffs to levels never seen previously in an attempt to strengthen the post-war economy, especially for farmers. However, in one of the biggest, moments of the 1920s, American trading partners followed suit and raised their own tariffs to counteract this measure. It was a short-lived victory for Republicans, as well as the farmers who initially benefited. Furthermore, the conservatives who dominated the 20s and early 30s, including Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, moved away from the efforts of their progressive predecessors by returning to laissez-faire policies last seen in the Gilded Age, such as favoring big business, lowering taxes, and weakening unions. This managed to fix everything, so long as you completely stop paying attention to our country's history after October 28, 1929. But we're getting just a little bit ahead of ourselves. Now, back in 1917, before the end of the war, a growing group of conservative evangelical Protestants, known as fundamentalists, began pushing for national prohibition of alcohol. It was presented as a battle for public morals and health, and eventually gained enough support from state legislators to see success. By 1919, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the production and sale of alcohol and forcing dads across the country to find something new to drink while staring at their freshly mowed lawn and their grass-stained New Balances. This constitutional change was enforced by the Volstead Act, which outlined the specifics of the new law. Now, while things were changing drastically for the United States, many countries in Europe were seeing their own identity crises. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which ended in a communist takeover, was of grave concern for many Americans who feared a similar uprising in the US. We already discussed how the hyper-nationalism of World War I led to the terrible mistreatment of many German Americans, but this was about to turn the volume of these actions up to 11. Nationalism turned to nativism and eventual racism as anti-radical hysteria and a fear of anarchy, socialism, and communism tore through the country. Soon many immigrants were being targeted and accused of crimes simply because of their skin color, their name, or their religion. A nativist policies limited immigration, and the Ku Klux Klan had a surge of new members who denounced anything they saw as less than 100% American. These fears made it to Washington, D.C., where Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led a campaign against suspected radicals. These Palmer raids, as we now refer to them, were conducted in 1919 and 20 and targeted organizations and homes of immigrants and foreign residents, many of whom were detained without a hearing. And nearly 600 of those detained were deported. For others to avoid this fate, Americanization, or the act of making something or someone assimilate into American society, became the norm both in policy and self-infliction. However, while detainment and deportation were not ideal for those caught in the crossfire, a much more dire situation was in store for the residents of the small Florida town of Rosewood only a few years later. There, racial tensions turned to chaos when a large group of white aggressors, including many from the KKK, attacked the inhabitants of Rosewood and destroyed the town as they searched for a man who was accused of assault on a white woman from a neighboring town. Reports show that there were 8 deaths in the massacre, but eyewitness accounts have claimed that number to be as high as 150. With more and more instances of these atrocities occurring in the South, the Great Migration of African Americans into the North picked up even more steam. Speaking of the South, despite their best efforts, it was in the year 1920 when women finally saw the light at the end of the suffrage tunnel, as the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Now, why do I keep picking on the South, you might ask? I promise it's not just because I'm a Cornhusker from Nebraska who grew up hating the SEC. My reasons are justified. 9 of the first 10 states to ratify the 19th Amendment were in the North, while the first 2 to reject it were Georgia and Alabama. Among the states to belatedly ratify the amendment were Florida and South Carolina in 1969, Georgia and Louisiana in 1970, and Mississippi in 1984. I'd say these states deserve everything I have to throw at them. E-man woman haters. Women had a renewed sense of empowerment during the 20s, and rightfully so. Aside from being called on to help in the workforce during the war, they had lived in a male-dominated society until this point, and they were happy to see some activity in the W column for once. In the years to follow, a social explosion for young women began with the popularity of jazz music in clubs and their desire to express themselves more freely in those urban settings. Flappers, as they were eventually named, would break the previously determined social norms by drinking, smoking, and dancing the Charleston, much to the chagrin of their Victorian-era parents. Also making a way for themselves during this time period were African Americans, many of whom were still looking to free themselves of the effects of racism, now more than 50 years removed from the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments discussed in episode 1. Don't remember? Go back and watch. Make sure you leave a like and try not to notice that I've gained weight since then. 1909 saw the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells Barnett, and Mary White Ovington, that focused on eliminating segregation and discrimination practices. When the Great Migration kicked off around 1916, Harlem in New York was among the areas that would become firmly established as a black residential and commercial area. Folks like Marcus Garvey, founder of a newspaper known as Negro World, used their voices to influence those in their communities, though Garvey's message was one of segregation rather than coexistence. Conversely, Booker T. Washington, while acknowledging many of the same issues presented by Garvey, encouraged African Americans to focus on creating opportunities for themselves, and that in their successes, they would earn the respect they so rightfully deserved. The explosion of culture that accompanied the Harlem Renaissance included names like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes in literature, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington in music, and Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence in art. So American citizens had gone from majority support for the war to a desire to distance our country from the problems of Europe and establish our own identity away from the Allies. Before we could do that, however, leaders of these countries had to try and hash out ways to avoid further conflict. The US called a conference in DC that lasted for 3 months, wherein 9 nations decided the fate of the Pacific Ocean as it related to each country's naval forces. The resulting 4-power treaty, 5-power treaty, and 9-power treaty, along with a few other agreements, shaped peace during the 1920s and ensured our Navy would still be one of the strongest. Take that, France and Italy. Unfortunately, that peace was short-lived and was not renewed, as so many of the countries who participated were affected by the Great Depression. All right, now before we go any further, I want to circle back to that Warren G. Harding character.
It's kind of easy when you listen to the G'd-up sound. Pioneer speakers bumping as I think on the pound.
No, not that Warren G., the other one.
There isn't anything the matter with the world's civilization, except that humanity is viewing it through a vision impaired in a cataclysmal war.
There, that's better. Now, President Harding didn't so much introduce a new era of conservative policies as he returned the country to those that had been established in the late 1800s following Reconstruction. And one of the policies he brought back was, if you're going to be president in this country, you better be having a scandal. Now, his was referred to as the Teapot Dome Scandal, named after an oil field in Wyoming, and it involved his Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, leasing oil-producing rights to private companies and receiving gifts in return for their preferential treatment. These gifts included zero-interest loans and other favors totaling more than $500,000, which would be close to $7.5 million today. He was later convicted of a felony, and his actions forever tainted the Harding administration. Although President Harding died in 1923 before anything came of the case against his Interior Secretary, his successor Calvin Coolidge was able to navigate the scandal well enough to win the next election for what would be a 6-year stint. One of the major accomplishments during his time in office was the Dawes Plan, which was constructed as a way to collect German reparations as part of the War Guilt Clause of the Treaty of Versailles. The Dawes Plan was named after Chairman Charles G. Dawes of the International Committee, tasked with ironing out the specifics of just how these stipulations would be achieved. It detailed an end to Allied occupation and constructed a loan system for both Germany's payments of reparations and U.S. allies' debt to America to be handled. A revised version of this plan was established in 1929 called the Yahng Plan. While the U.S. was looking to receive money for France and Britain's war debt, they were also looking to stabilize Europe as a means to strengthen the global economy. And now we return to your regularly scheduled craziness that was the 1920s. Remember when I mentioned those Protestant fundamentals who tried to ruin shower beers for dads across the country? Well, another instance of their impact on society was put on display when they clashed with modernists during the highly publicized Scopes monkey trial. A side note, I was very disappointed when I learned that it was called the monkey trial because it dealt with evolution and not because there would be an actual monkey on trial. Now, here are the facts. In 1925, a substitute high school teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach human evolution in any state-funded school for fear that it would undermine creationism. Now, Scopes couldn't even remember if he had actually taught evolution in the classroom, but chose to incriminate himself so as to become the defendant in the case. William Jennings Bryan of Cross of Gold fame spoke for the prosecution opposite Clarence Darrow of the defense. Although Scopes lost initially, his conviction was overturned on a technicality upon appeal. Fundamentalists walked away with the win, and it wasn't until 1967 that Tennessee would repeal the law. As we reached the latter years of the 20s, focus returned to our relationship with European allies. One of those allies, France, had noticed our relationship had cooled off a bit as we left the honeymoon phase following World War I. Fearing they would lose us as a partner, French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand proposed an agreement with the U.S. that would outlaw war between the two countries. U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, not of cereal fame, countered with a proposal for a multilateral pact that would be open for all nations to sign on. 62 nations ultimately signed the pact, and so long as you ignore situations such as the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, or the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and the German invasion of Poland, it worked out perfectly.
Nope.
Now, this pact was also used as the legal basis during the Nuremberg trials that sentenced some of those responsible for crimes against peace after World War II. And now we've reached the actual end of our time together for episode 6, the Roaring Twenties. Boy, what a roller coaster of events. While the decade brought us some good in the 19th Amendment and the Harlem Renaissance, we also found that it was a time of harsh nativism and racism. On this channel, we will never shy away from teaching of America's faults as well as its merits. That's how you grow. You acknowledge your weaknesses and learn from them. Now, I have a little favor to ask of all of you watching, whether it's on YouTube or TikTok. If you heard something in this episode that you hadn't heard before, leave a comment about it. Or maybe I was only able to present the tip of the iceberg on a topic, something I have to do all the time, or else these would be way longer, and you'd like to know more. Let me know. We'll see you next time.